In 1543, just before his death, Copernicus published his On the Revolution of the Solar Spheres. This is an event that is largely considered one of the seminal moments that sparked the scientific revolution. Now, of course, he wasn't the first person to propose a heliocentric model of the universe. He was just the first one to do it convincingly. Heliocentrism had been proposed and dismissed as far back as ancient Greece, and when we look at it with the benefit of hindsight, we have this habit of dismissing the people who wanted to keep the Earth at the center as just being pig-headed traditionalists and religious dogmatists, and obviously some of them were, but with our distorted lens of modernity, it's easy to forget that there were also logical reasons to doubt heliocentrism. Take the problem of the stellar parallax, or lack thereof. Ancient Greek astronomers reckoned that if the Earth was moving around the sun, we should see a slight difference in the position of the stars from one side of our orbit to the other. Think of one side of the orbit as your left eye, the other side as your right, and the stars in the background as your thumb, right? When you look from one eye to the other, the orientation of your thumb should move. And of course, if we're orbiting the sun, that has to be true of the stars. That would have to happen. And it does. It does happen. It's just that none of the ancient Greeks had the blindest clue just how far away the stars were in comparison to like how small our orbit was. So they were all radically overestimating how much the stars should shift. In fact, telescope technology didn't advance enough to measure that difference until 1838. So for almost 3 centuries after Copernicus proposed his theory, this was basically an unsolved problem. Now, I say basically because long before that, we'd figured out the stars were way further out than we'd been assuming, and nobody was holding out on heliocentrism until the 1838 parallax data came through. But at the time of the original publication, this was a really sound argument against it. But of course, not all the objections were intelligent. Some of them were religious. For example, legend has it that Martin Luther was asked about Copernicus's theory at a university dinner where he famously remarked, quote, "So it goes now. Whoever wants to be clever must agree with nothing others esteem. He must do something of his own. This is what that fool does who wishes to turn the whole of astronomy upside down. Even in these things that are thrown in disorder, I believe the Holy Scriptures, for Joshua commanded the sun to stand still and not the earth." End quote. So there you go. If the Earth revolves around the sun, the story about the magic war Jew wouldn't even make sense. But of course, the real irony of this quote is how dismissive Luther is being about people who want to do something of their own and turn established shit upside down, right? I mean, after all, this would have been like 30 years after he kicked off the Protestant Revolution with his fateful post-it note. Now, obviously, widespread religious intransigence slowed the acceptance of the sun-centered model, but over the next century, the facts became harder and harder to ignore, and by the middle of the 18th century, even the church was getting on board. As we collected more and more data, the evidence eventually settled the issue. And now, of course, but for a couple of cranks that nobody takes seriously, we all agree that the Earth orbits the sun, even if half of Americans still get that wrong when you survey them. And that's the beauty of science, right? Like, eventually the disagreements get adjudicated by the facts. Meanwhile, what about that other 16th century conflict we mentioned? The one with the post-it note. Martin Luther got into an argument with Catholicism half a century ago about the nature of their magical cracker, and to this day, we're no closer to settling it. Protestants and Catholics didn't collect sacro-mycological observation to compare against actual cracker behavior. They didn't take DNA samplings from pre- and post-liturgy Eucharists. In 5 centuries, they've never honed in on the answer. In fact, the exact opposite has happened. The Protestant church just keeps getting into these minor, stupid disagreements with itself and splitting off every generation or two, and that's a process that continues to this day. That is not how true things behave. You look at anything that's verifiably true. A couple hundred years ago, there was far less agreement in the world of biology or physics, or take your fucking pick. But as we learn more and models more closely approximate reality, the differences get whittled down. We converge on the truth. And sure, cutting-edge theorists will still have plenty to argue about, but I don't think anybody expects us to still be arguing about string theory in 500 years. By then, we'll have confirmed it or dismissed it. And when you look across the world, you don't see different sciences with every country, right? There's not a Japanese version of chemistry or a Bolivian kind of biology. There's just biology. There's just chemistry. And what's true in China is true in America, is true in Zaire. Scientific debates, unlike theological debates, go somewhere. Now, religion isn't by itself here. There are plenty of things that act just like religion in this way, right? Culture, fashion, language, artistic trends. In other words, things that have no innate truth value. There's no true language, so languages can split off indefinitely. One might subsume another, one might borrow from another, but you don't see them narrowing down on the one true language over time. There's no objectively correct series of phonemes that mean unexceptional. We've just chosen unexceptia and null as a social convention. It's no more or less correct than the Spanish or Romanian term for the same word. And again, this is just the natural byproduct of having no truth value. Sunnis and Shiites have had 14 centuries to figure out who was supposed to succeed Muhammad, and I'd reckon most Muslims would agree that if we gave them another 14 centuries, they'd be no closer to the answer. Unless one group kills the other one off sufficiently, or humanity outgrows religion, fingers crossed, there will always be Sunni and Shia. They're never going to see one really convincing argument in a peer-reviewed theological paper that's going to make them say, well, shit, I guess it was supposed to be Muhammad's kids. Our bad, we're back in the fold. And it's not just succession issues or divine cracker properties here. It's not like these are just a few little areas where religion disagrees. Every detail is like that. What is God? What does he want from us? What does he love? Who does he hate? What is he made of? Where is he? What are his properties? All these questions grow more and more divergent with every passing generation of theists, exactly as though there was no truth behind it. Religion is an element of culture. It's just like language or music or diet. I mean, it's not just like those things, of course, because nobody kills anybody over their ethnic cuisine, but that's largely because it's an element of culture that's trying to pretend like it's an element of truth. But it's not even like truth. It doesn't even behave in the same way as truth. As any legitimate field of study gets older, it grows less and less factionalized as it moves ever closer to the truth. It converges. It does not diverge. And we almost certainly will never reach that absolute. There will always be room for disagreement at the leading edge of our knowledge, but it'll be clear that this generation is closer to the truth than the last one, and 100 years from now we'll be 100 years closer than that. And the Protestants and the Catholics will still be arguing about a fucking cracker, because you can never get any closer to something that doesn't exist.